All right, welcome to the Leon Toddcast, episode number 2. I'm sitting down with Michael Sheldrick, who is the Vice President of Global Citizen. He's got a very, very interesting story. He does some incredible work. This guy's actually out there changing the world, as well as working with some of the biggest artists in contemporary music today. So if you're in any way interested in music or, world affairs or anything like that, hopefully you will find this very interesting. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for being here, and good seeing you again, Leon.
What would you say, how would you describe your, role at Global Citizen? And just give me a very brief introduction to what you do and for all the listeners.
Yeah, so for those that haven't heard of Global Citizen, we're a movement, and we're a movement of really millions of people who consume our content at globalcitizen.org, take action, and when I mean take action, it's using our voice to hold leaders accountable, and ultimately striving for a world without extreme poverty by 2030. And I've been, involved with Global Citizen, really since the start. It's been a decade journey, and currently I'm one of our vice presidents, and my job, if you like, is to make sure, okay, we have millions of people taking action. How do we actually make sure we channel all of this energy, excitement, and passion and actually have impact that affects real people and changes lives?
So in that role, and I'm sure this will be the thing that will be of interest to most people listening, you've worked with not just some of the biggest, literally the biggest names in contemporary music, from Rihanna to Beyonce, Chris Martin from Coldplay, Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam. How does a guy from the northern suburbs of Perth, Western Australia, end up living in New York and working with these people and, setting the rather lofty goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030? I want to unpack all of that for maybe the first 10 or 15 minutes. So give me, just tell me a little bit about your life growing up, and how, I should add a disclaimer as well. The reason I've been able to grab Michael to sit down here is we went to high school together. He's one of my very best friends, and kind of watching your journey unfold has been really, really phenomenal. Because, for somebody like me, I'm a musician, and my, obviously my dreams are, to world domination via music, and you're so much more in tune with that than I will ever be. So, I guess just give us a little bit of a background as, how did you end up in Perth, I guess?
Yeah, and disclaimer, Leon actually beat me. You actually beat me for the smartest kid in high school when we graduated, the Ducks, or I think in America they call it a valedictorian. So you always have that over me, of course. But
what a great thing to have over, something that happened 13 years ago that's
a long time
completely irrelevant.
Some of us never forget.
Mate, and that's why you're Vice President of Global Citizen, and I'm speaking to a few thousand people on YouTube. But moving on from that,
So I guess we obviously grew up not far away from where we are now, and I'm sure you've said this to many of your American listeners. Living in New York, I often try and describe Perth, and I think I've settled on a kind of Southern California, San Diego lifestyle.
Precisely. I've been to San Diego. We played there a few years ago, and we were just like, oh my God, this is Perth?
Yeah, exactly. That kind of climate, cultural lifestyle, if you like, politically, economically, maybe somewhere with a cross with Texas and Greater California. That's how I describe Perth. So, it was very Southern Californian upbringing, I guess. It just happens to be in the middle of nowhere. And I can say that after having just flown 35 hours back from New York to be here, a long flight. But I guess, for me, as I was finishing high school, you remember I was studying law, studying history, studying political science. And, for me, as I was thinking through, how do I really make a difference? I got involved in a bunch of initiatives, and how I came to the cause of extreme poverty was, I guess, just a recognition that, we were finishing high school and people were saying about how smart we were. But really, I never really felt that talented, that intelligent. I felt, yes, I had this great opportunity, I worked hard, but it was just a recognition that there was millions of children around the world who, through no fault of their own, maybe they lack a great teacher, maybe because of a kind of stupid poverty where a child dies before the age of 5 because of a lack of vaccine, they will never realize their potential. I guess it was that kind of poverty, that lack of opportunity that I felt was an injustice, that children would just never, no matter how hard they work, might never be able to realize their dreams. And so, at school, at university, and I think you were there, the very first thing I did was that quiz night at our old high school.
I remember that well.
College. We raised $1,000 to build a school in Papua New Guinea. But quickly you learn, actually, this wasn't a question of charity. This was a question, poverty is a political question, and it's about structures that keep people poor. And, okay, well, how do we address that? Well, ultimately, you can see it through the anti-slave trade movement 200 years ago. You can see it through the civil rights movement in America. More recently, you saw it 20, 30 years ago in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. It's through basically activism. And, so we got together, a group of us student activists, and if you like, from there, that was the basis of Global Citizen, was to get people engaged. But how I then got involved in, well, how did this lead to music? End in extreme poverty. And it is possible. There's a goal, there's a roadmap that exists by the UN, and it says we can end extreme poverty by 2030, and it very concrete, tangible ways how we can do this. I guess, it's still a lofty goal to try and explain to people. So we felt, well, okay, what's something that is perhaps a little bit more clear-cut, tangible? And we focused on the issue of polio. Polio is this ancient disease, almost eradicated, and it could become the second human disease in history to be eradicated after smallpox. Rotary International done a great job bringing it to 99% of the way to eradication, but it was still this small section of cases left. And we felt, well, if we could mobilize, enough money from governments to make this a priority, eradicate this disease, then what better way to say that the end of extreme poverty is possible than to say, hey, look, with your help, we just eradicated this disease. And so, as you do, we were figuring out how do we make this an issue. And in start of 2011, so I was 22 at the time. Long story short, I won't go into, but in Fremantle, which is a suburb of Perth, southern Perth, I found myself face to face with our then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who was Australia's first female Prime Minister, a woman who would later know really well, and one of the most surreal moments of my life later on would be basically spending time with her and Rihanna in Africa, in Malawi, but that's a separate story.
That's a whole other thing to unpack, isn't it? That's amazing.
It did involve singing in Rihanna's presence the Australian national anthem on Australia Day in Malawi. But anyway, another story. But anyway, essentially, the conversation with Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister, and I asked her, would she make this a priority? Would she contribute funding towards the eradication of polio? I remember she turned around and she said something which I've never really forgotten. She said, I need some help with this. And I thought, you're the most powerful person in the country. What do you mean you need some help to put this on the agenda? And it's actually something Bono, another musician, said. Years earlier in 2006, I had been at the Make Poverty History concert in Melbourne. It was November 17th, 2006. And it was my first time. It was 15,000 people. And it was my first time I would see Bono, who I've seen several times since, and Eddie Vedder, who, I've spoken to, and he's performed, and he's just a great guy. But they actually performed at this concert in 2006, and I remember Bono talking to all the young people then, and he said, are you angry? And they said, yeah, we're angry. And he said, do you want to do something about this? Yes. And then he just turned around and he said, wow. He said, we can't blame the politicians, because at the end of the day, we have to give them permission to spend what is in the end our money. And maybe it was, that recognition, okay, well, we need to you know, Julia Gillard, when she's asking for help, she's asking for permission. And maybe it's because I remembered that quote from Bono, I don't know, but I turned around and I said to the Prime Minister, and we had been talking about maybe doing a concert of sorts, but it probably wasn't ready to be pitched. And I just said, well, what about doing a concert? We'd bring together, you know, big artists, bring together thousands of people. That will shine the public spotlight on this issue. And there you go, here's your mandate. This shows people care about this, act. And she kind of said, well, if you can do that, we've got a deal. And
so in a sense, you're using pop to essentially drive civic engagement.
That was the idea.
And my question, I'm sure a lot of people listening at the moment are probably thinking, what's the difference between Global Citizen and something like Live Aid, you know, in the 80s, which I'm sure a lot of people probably look back at with a fair degree of cynicism now, where you've got celebrities converging on these, you know, like they're you know, preaching this big message, but then it's very hard to see how it's a top-down kind of thing. Yeah. How is Global Citizen different to something like a Live Aid or any of the similar movements?
And I certainly don't dismiss Live Aid. In many sense, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and charitable concerts from George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden through to Live Aid, Band Aid, Sir Bob Geldof. In many ways, you know, that paved the way for this kind of thinking. But you're right in the sense that in the mid-'80s, it was definitely more of a charitable mindset. So it was like, okay, we will raise money through this appeal, and we will donate that to address the famine in East Africa.
Addressing it in parallel to what governments might have already been doing,
exactly. Right? And, you know, if we're being fair dinkum, as we say, you know, at the time it was very much a immediate response humanitarian. There's a famine here. Let's address this. Let's you know, put a band-aid on this. And it was, you know, had significant impact, raised public consciousness. But I guess what we're thinking about, well, okay, ending poverty at the end of the day, as Nelson Mandela said, it isn't an act of charity, it's an act of justice. These are structural issues. You know, it's going to require billions of dollars to shift if we're going to end it. And for us, no amount of gala night dinners, quiz nights is enough to end extreme poverty. What you need fundamentally is a movement. And so for us, it was built on the idea, how can we use music as a way to catalyze a long-term movement of action takers, activists that would use their voice to hold their leaders and business leaders accountable. And so we kind of evolved the model of charitable concerts and basically said, listen, you can't buy your way into this. You can't purchase a ticket. We're not going to give tickets away for free. But what we will do, and it was dreamed up by a Californian guy actually, Ryan Gould, it was his idea, and he's rightly credited as being one of our co-founders of the Global Citizen Festival, but was built on the idea that, listen, if you want to come to this show and see some of these great artists, you've got to take action, use your voice, and in taking action, you will earn points, and you can then trade in those points to go in the draw to earn tickets to this show. And although our very first Global Citizen Festival, took place in September 2012 with the Foo Fighters and Neil Young, actually, our very first concert we organised as a group was actually here in Perth. It was in response to that challenge, if you like, Prime Minister Julia Gillard had set, okay, give us permission and we will contribute to polio. And actually, I remember we did it on the fringes of Perth, and we convinced John Legend to fly all the way out to Perth, which was a big deal. He spent more time flying to and from than he was actually in the ground.
Because no one ever comes to Perth. No. When big artists tour in Perth, when big artists tour Australia, I should say, they always skip Perth. So that is something I want to hone in on. Because as a little, in parallel to all of this, how would you describe your relationship with music growing up? I mean, a rather infamous story is that about 10 years ago, a friend of ours was relaying a story where someone asked you what your favorite song is. And I think you couldn't really come up with a response. And I think you might have said Hotel California or, something like that.
Or or should I dare I say Bryan Adams or something?
I mean, and hey, I'm going to stand in the corner and say that Bryan Adams is great, and people who diss Bryan Adams should get a life, you know what I mean? But I think at the time, when you're 20, there's this for people, that's a time when people really dive deep into this world of, I guess, underground music, or you kind of find your niche. I know for me, obviously growing up as in a musical household, music's been this like non-negotiable part of my life. But what was your relationship with music up to that point?
I mean, I think the best. Listen, when we was talking about when we finished high school, and I think I was voted most likely to become a world leader or something like that. Also, most likely to become a millionaire, which clearly hasn't happened. But I don't think anyone probably expected me to end up in this particular field. And I always remember when we was announcing that concert we did with John Legend. It was called the End of Polio concert. I always remember. You remember Gillian Lee's?
Yes.
She posted on my Facebook wall. And she was like, I was in the car this morning on the radio, and I'm pretty sure I just heard Michael Sheldrick announcing the lineup for a concert, including John Legend. Like, what is going on?
Yeah, it's sort of what's happening in this world. And how... So, I mean, to summarize, I'm sure that, like...
Music was not a big part of my teenage high school years.
Yeah. For me, all I wanted to do was play music and try to get laid in high school. That was, and I was very unsuccessful at both. So essentially, kind of what you're saying is, it's almost like, the archetype of what back then people just say is like a nerd. You're into history, political science, you're at school working hard, and you've got this kind of fire... of activism sort of burning. So how do you make that connection from a bunch of kids at uni who have this, like goal of let's mobilize political action around eradicating polio? I guess the side branch is Australia was the first country to eliminate polio.
One of the first. Australia was one of the first. There was a vaccine developed in the 50s by a gentleman called Jonas Salk, who in America is a bit of a household name, but it was eradicated in Australia from memory in 1972.
Wow! So that's that's a massive. That's another thing that you're building on. So, to shift the focus towards that sort of musical bent, how do you get a hold of somebody like a John Legend?
Yeah.
How do you do that? I'm sure so many people are interested because they're playing in bands, and they might just be trying to book a gig at their local club. How do you fire up your network to... The thing about artists that I've realised, and I've got enormous respect for some of these individuals, people like John Legend, people like Chris Martin, people like Rihanna, is they genuinely want to help. But they want to, they get requests all the time, and I genuinely think they want to help, but they want to help in a way where they can actually make a unique difference. Yep.
Something which is not just going to be tokenistic, but they want to genuinely figure out how they can meaningfully leverage their networks, their talents to make a difference. And I think at Global Citizen, what we've come up with is a way of connecting very serious issues, public policy issues as well, with artists and their passions and interests, and showing them how not only they can make a concrete difference in terms of moving the needle, but, and this is important, if you look at Rihanna, her fan base, she calls it the Navy. It's important, like that is a key part of her life. How do they take that constituency along as well and engage? And many of them are looking for ways to take their fans on this journey with them. And so I think at Global Citizen, I think other groups do it, but I think we've come up with a way that is respected and is credible, and is looked upon as a bit of a model for how to do this. And how do you engage these artists? Well, I think initially, again, it was being very clear in how you could make a difference. And we banned the phrase awareness raising. You spoke at the start, people are skeptical.
It's the exact same thing when you're playing in a band and someone says, hey, we want to play your music on our show, or we want you to play a show. We can't pay you, but it'll be great exposure.
Yeah.
So how do you cut through that, inevitable as a professional musician, that's like anathema.
Exactly. And I still remember when we were trying to secure John Legend, basically after that discussion with Julia Gillard, we were like, wow, if we deliver this, we could raise tens of millions of dollars for polio eradication. We could really seriously move the needle. And I remember this incredible woman. She had been involved in Coachella Sings. She was from Utah. She had met an Australian guy from Queensland. She had moved out here. And, we had no money to pay her at the time, but she committed to getting on board. And I remember she just asked me, because, there's so many awareness raising, so many things, but you can't measure that. You can't, it's not quantifiable.
There's no metric.
And I remember her saying, do you really believe that the Prime Minister will deliver if we put on this concert? And I said, I do. I really think. And she said, all right. And it took that message back to America. Other people got on board. And before you know it, John Legend was coming out here. But again, it was being very clear about where the impact could be. And awareness raising, we actually banned that phrase. We talk about impact. We talk about what is the measurable qualitative impact on the ground. Like since our very first Global Citizen Festival, global citizens to earn tickets, they've taken more than 15 million actions, which has led to something in the region of more than $37 billion worth of commitments which sounds like a lot of money. Unfortunately, in the grand scheme of things, it's not enough.
What's that in the scope of, say, the American GDP? How many trillions of dollars?
In the American,
I mean, that's a few percent,
the
right?
American economy is like over $12 trillion.
Yeah, okay. So it's
a small amount.
It's a lot of money if we're talking about, a musician.
Exactly. It sounds like a lot. In the grand scheme of GDP, it's
how many streams would Rihanna have to make $37 billion?
But at the same time, for the amount of good it can do. I mean, you look at the American military budgets, hundreds of billions a year, right?
Yeah.
But you look at the impact of this money, you're literally changing lives. And so for us, I guess, that's what I think swayed in the initial sense with John Legend. And at the end of it, we were able to go back to him and say, listen, as a result of this concert, we were able to mobilize thousands of people. They took action, they signed petition, they wrote letters to politicians. And listen, politicians actually responded. And for a lot of artists, I've heard managers and others say that they like the positive nature of this. They like the fact you can see impact. They like the fact that they're performing, to a sea of people, tens of thousands that have all taken action to be in this one venue. It is a different atmosphere. And, I think that draws them in.
Do you find a really interesting thing that I've been thinking about is when you're talking about having to approach, the lady from Utah, for example, and Lindsay. So it seems there that there was like a very, it's like there's this act of faith almost, and that you two are acting in very good faith with one another. And there's sort of almost this like set of falling dominoes, which which is a very political kind of thing. But do you find a similarity between, I guess, the convictions that you require as an activist, whether it's not necessarily maybe it has something in common with like a religious conviction, but there would be obviously a lot of people who you're working with who are probably very deeply religious and committed to these causes. But in the secular world of, like well-educated, relatively wealthy people in the West, there's this, I guess this faith in the good of people. And the way that often manifests itself is musicians talk about this all the time. It's music brings people together. It's, regardless of race, creed, all these things, it's like when you're playing music, none of that matters because it's this language which cuts across culture, it cuts across time and all these other kind of things. Together, so do you see it seems like an inevitable thing to want to fuse together. Everybody's cynical about so much stuff except music.
We literally call it, our fusion, our formula, secret sauce, whatever you want to call it, we literally call it pop and policy. That's our model. That's how we define it.
So how do you? I mean, like I'm saying, a lot of the people listening to this are probably, not very interested in the policy applications of it, but the sort of organizational things that you've had to take on in your role in, it seems like from that very brief description we've gone over, it's like you're trying to change the culture, not only around the way policy is fed out and trickled down, but also in the way musicians can use their leverage with their fan base. I guess because of social media, you have, as you're saying, Rihanna, the Navy, or Beyonce, you have the Beehive, or you've got these very active communities, which are not negligible in size. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people. How do you go about creating a culture around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's take Rihanna as an example of this, because she's an extraordinary woman, and I've got a lot of respect for her. But let's look at, traditionally, I think, the way someone like Rihanna would have, presumed to have made a difference is, let's say it's the cause of education. She's very passionate about extended opportunity. There's two ways you could have done it. Firstly is, let's crowd raise a few $1 million and build a school, name it after you, in Malawi or somewhere, that is of a particular interest to her. The second piece would be, let's raise awareness about the fact that, hundreds of millions of children, live without access to education, and let's raise awareness of the problem, right? So it's either charitable band-aid,
do something, or make people aware of something
of the problem.
Yep.
With us, we kind of take a different approach, and it's like, let's take those hundreds of millions of children that don't have access to education, and we paint a roadmap, and it does take a little bit of understanding and patience. But we basically show a roadmap as to, this is how we're going to address that. This is the role that you can play within that. And by the way, your fans are arguably the most important part of coming on that journey. And so with Rihanna, we basically told her about this plan that actually Julia Gillard, funnily enough, after she left the Prime Ministership of Australia, she took over this global organisation called the Global Partnership for Education, which she chairs, which is all about how do you actually support developing countries across 89 countries actually manage their entire school systems. So it's not just one school on the periphery, it's like, how do you get them to revolutionize their entire school systems? And the cost of this across 89 countries was $3.1 billion. And we met with Rihanna and we said, you could use your voice, you could use the Navy as well, take them on this journey, a powerful constituency, and we could help raise that 3.1 billion, which could change the lives of millions of children. Go from one school to millions of children on this systemic level. And she came with us, Julia Gillard and our team. We took her to Malawi. She saw both at the school level, the headmaster level, understood the needs of the school. We met with the education minister, the president, and then she started meeting with world leaders. She met with President Macron of France. She met with various other ministers and heads of state. And then when we were trying to get them to raise money, what she would do? She would say, come on, Navy, let's get these leaders to contribute and make this a priority. And she would start tweeting at them. She was like, hey, checking in Germany, have you guys stepped up? Come on, Macron, you made this promise. Don't let me down now. Come on, Justin Trudeau. And you could see this energy, right? And all of a sudden, this plan developed by Julia Gillard, one of the smartest leaders in the world when it comes to how do you address education, globally. All of a sudden, this plan had now, become far more broader, far more mainstream, and it was getting the attention of leaders. And, just to show you an example of how this ultimately had impact. Earlier this year, we were in Senegal, which is a country on the west coast of Africa. And it's a Francophonie country, and the president of France was there. We had this big conference, and this is like, I mentioned the 3.1 billion, so this was now D-Day in the sense that this day countries were going to be pledging money towards us.
You're passing the hat around.
Exactly.
You know?
And again, this is not about building a school here and there. This is about raising billions to address these needs once and for all. And we were in the same hotel as the president of France. And we had heard, and this is I guess where my role comes in a little bit, you know, you check these things, but we had heard that actually the French government were looking at, you know, they had initially agreed that they would announce $200 million. When we were checking the numbers the day before, we found out that actually $100 million was, and I should say euros, sorry, not dollars, 100 million euros was new money. The other 100 million was actually repackaged, right? It was something they had already done. It wasn't new money, but they were going to re-announce it.
But it's got political expediency to re-announce it, right?
So the night before, literally the next day, she'll be standing at this conference with the president of France. She sends him a tweet, and of course, I think Rihanna's got the 4th largest Twitter following in the world.
Wow, okay.
And she calls him out and she says, "Come on, Mr. President, when we see each other tomorrow, I hope you will come up with 200 million euros in new funding." Like, it was as pointed and clear as that. And we didn't know if he would deliver. And I remember the next day we sat there and the president was right in front of us. And it was then he did announce, and he put the emphasis on 200 million in new funding towards this initiative. And so I look at that, you know, that was not charitable, that was systemic, and it wasn't just raising awareness about a global problem, but it was actually trying to come up with a global solution. And the biggest thing about it is it was also, she took her fans on the journey. I mean, they would then tweet, you know, I think some of these presidents and heads of state and prime ministers had probably never received so much traction on social
Fascinating,
media,
yeah.
you know.
Cracking through that bubble. I guess slightly, so, I mean, aside from being absolutely, you know, like an amazing process to be part of, the thing that seems to be interesting there, that I'm sure would relate to a lot of people who, you know, if we're linking this back to, say, you're, let's try to relate this back to music for a second. Say you're like a kid playing guitar. You're like 14 or 15, or, you know, you're a dude who's in their 40s, and I guess at any sort of level, and, you know, you'd probably be coming to music with like a fair degree of self-interest. You know, you play guitar because you want to do it, or you play an instrument. Yeah. How, in terms of generating opportunities in that way, as you said, that sort of like engagement where it's somebody going, you know, we've made an agreement with somebody at some point, and down the line they're sort of going lukewarm on it. And what sort of what's the best way to phrase this? You know, if you're trying to generate these kind of opportunities for yourself, what set of skills do you have now that you wish you had 10, 15 years ago when it comes to, just in terms of, is it that doggedness of being able to follow up with people? But how do you do that without being a total pest and putting people off?
A couple of things. I think firstly, clarity of focus, clarity of mission. You know, when I left high school, my first year at university, I signed up to everything. I said yes to everything. And I quickly realized that I was doing all of these things, but nothing particularly well.
Yep.
Right? I was overloading at university, in a rush to get through that. And it was just exhausting. And by the end of it, you felt that you had been really busy. But you know, when you feel like you're really busy, but what have you actually achieved? Yeah, right. So again, back to impact, I guess, would be exactly. So, and you know, you've done this. You really, like, you could have gone on and done your PhD in maths and all of this, but instead you decided to focus yourself to music. And I think, you know, when I look at this campaign, I was speaking about the polio campaign in which John Legend was involved in. That just became my overriding focus. And so I think clarity of purpose, knowing what that impact is you want to achieve. So, for example, I guess if you're somebody in a band, you know, and your band's starting out and you want to try to get some shows, you know, there's a long stretch that I'm pulling here, but I'm trying to keep this somewhat relevant, I guess, to the music thing. Hopefully to, you know, help some people out there who are struggling with this. You know, the temptation is say yes to everything or play for free, but it's maybe delineate what you actually want to do. Exactly. It's you know, you end up performing everything and not making a profit. In the end, what you end up doing is actually diminishing your own value. Right. Because it's like, well, if you play for everyone free, why is anyone going to pay for you? And again, you can fall into this false premise where
I'm busy.
Yeah, you're busy, and you also think, okay, this is going to help me get my name out there as well. This is going to help me get that recognition. But you've got to be careful of that, because it's not just getting your name out there; it's also in the right way as well. And I think if I think through your listeners, many of them are probably thinking through, well, okay, is there a fallback option, because they're like, what happens if my music career doesn't work out? Should I be doing these other things as well? I mean, it's hard, but if you look at a lot of the people that succeed, it's that they throw themselves into it. I mean, listen, like I was almost going to end up as a lawyer, and when I took this gig on to do this campaign around polio, they could barely, I was getting paid barely minimum wage. I think 2 days a week, even though it was 3 days a week, and when I decided to go to America to throw myself into the Global Citizen Festival, we had no idea if we were going to be able to get paid in the long term, if this was going to work out.
It could have very easily fallen on flat ears and
exactly.
been a one-off with some big bands.
Exactly. And I still remember the first time I went to New York for this in 2011, I was about to do a clerkship. And ideally, I remember thinking I would do this clerkship and then go to New York, because if this all fails, then I can pursue my legal career.
Yeah.
But it was actually, no, this is happening now. If you want to be part of it, get on the plane and come to New York now.
Yeah.
And I just I rang up this law firm and I just said, sorry, I can't do this. I'm going there. And I think at the end of the day, if we can kid ourselves and we can worry about what are we going to become, but we also can't take ourselves too seriously. And someone gave me the best advice about this. It was actually a fellow lawyer. And if you're ever wondering, whether or not you should throw yourself into that career or pursue something, whether it's accountant, fallback career, go and ask some people in that career that you're planning on falling back. Because that's what I did. I had coffee with some people who were lawyers, and they said, Michael, there's never going to be any shortage of need for lawyers around here, right? But go to New York, do it, because at least if it doesn't work out, you have no regrets.
I guess the thing is as well, not everybody is necessarily going to be presented with that opportunity, to travel to New York and do something like that. And there seems to be a fair amount of the last podcast I did with my friends Chris and Ash, speaking to him, that you need a bit of courage to do these things, and if you're not making a choice that has the full spec, that one non-zero probability outcome is utter failure, then it's almost like you're not pursuing the right thing.
Yeah, these things aren't guaranteed.
Yeah,
you're right.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, it's amazing. I often have people, or in our early days, I didn't have enough money to pay people, right? So I had a lot of people volunteering, and they inevitably asked if this would lead to a job. And I said, I don't know. But you know what?
Very similar to music.
Yeah. You know what? Like, if a job does come up, it's probably you volunteered, and I've seen how you've gone, you're probably more likely to get into it. I don't know. And I would get people saying, oh, I don't know if I can give this up then if I can't come and volunteer. Like, it's hard. It's not there. And I would say the other key thing, you asked, what's a critical part, is I would say genuineness, authenticity, and knowing why you're doing it as well. You said to me, how do you, not just appear like a pest to people? And to me, I think it's very important that when whether it be a young musician or whatever, when you're getting started and you're asking people for support, you got to remember, this is what my mate Akram always says, it's not what people do or how they do it that makes them interesting, it's why they do it. And I think...
Very interesting.
Yeah, people will smell BS, right? I can imagine you're a young musician, you're going to mentors, you're trying to get support.
Well, even that idea of having mentors, I think, is a thing that a lot of young musos overlook. It's probably a far more integrated part of the community that you're in. But how do you, I guess for you, what sort of impact have those, just to take a sideline again, what sort of impact have having good mentors made for you?
Very important. And you know what? Sometimes it's very easy to forget the value of mentors and fall into the trap of thinking you know it all.
Yeah.
And then it's funny, and you find yourself getting stressed, and then you're like, hold on, why don't I just ask someone for advice? You know, I think internet, Facebook, Twitter, it's amazing tools, right? But in some ways, one thing it's done is it's often stopped us having conversation in real time, like you and I right now, that we would have had 10, 20 years ago.
I mean, we've had this chat. It feels like, you know, every time we see one another, we sort of dive deep, which is why I wanted to record this, because I think there's so much value that you can offer.
But one of the, social media is great. It's brought people together. And in fact, you know, our movement is built on people having access to social media. But at the same time, you can achieve a lot by picking up the phone to someone and just asking them a question or advice. It never ceases to amaze me when I'm feeling stressed and, you know, I'm just like, why don't I just ask someone else what they would do in this situation? And I think, just ask the question. You know, mentoring doesn't have to be something formal. It's just, it could be your friend, frankly, that you pick up the phone and say, what do you think of this? But I put a lot of value on that. And the thing I always tell my interns or my team is pick up the phone, talk to people.
But I can definitely agree with that. I remember, it'd be 5 years ago now, we were in the States. We were doing our second tour. You know, at that stage, we had two people who were meant to be managing us. And we got mega duped. We got told we had this 20-odd date tour. None of the dates were booked. This guy ripped us off. And I remember sitting there in like the middle of Oklahoma, like feeling so far away from home, feeling so scared. Like, what are we going to do? We'd booked tickets for 10 weeks. We were on this epic tour. Wow. And basically sitting around with the guys and saying, what do you want to do? Do you want to fly home, or should we try pick up some gigs? And I remember sitting there, like we're sitting at a dinner table at the moment, very similar situation, and I just called up every person that I knew in the United States and asked, hey, do you know anybody? And for me, that absolutely changed my life. We ended up having this great tour. I ended up making so many great, genuine connections with people. And for me, that, you know, I'd lived in this bubble my life where I didn't really network with people or understand what it was. And that was sort of my introduction to it. And still, if I need something done or I need help, picking up the phone is so much more powerful than an email or a tweet.
And again, it's because you're authentic. People know you're passionate about music, and they'll be willing to answer your calls. And I think a lot of people, especially young people who've grown up on social media, you don't have to carry these burdens by yourself. Like, if you're doing it for the right reasons, people will help you. I remember we're fortunate that on our board we have a guy called Jay Brown. Jay Brown, a remarkable guy, as well as being Rihanna's manager, Shakira's manager. Jay also co-founded with Jay-Z Rock Nation.
Oh,
so
right.
He's when it comes to the music,
he's a big dog.
He's a big deal. But like Jay-Z, you know, he's had to build this company, you know, from the ground up. And I remember we were with him once traveling, and our CEO Hugh Evans just asked him, and he said, "Do you think people will, you know, come to resent us if we keep asking people for help? Like asking them for help? Like, will people think we're pests?
Are we going to be pests?"
And he kind of laughed. He goes, "Well," he said, "Yeah, but they'd still do it because they understand why you're doing it.
Yeah,
they
right.
understand your motives are good and what you're trying to do." And he basically said, "So don't stop doing that. Keep doing that."
Yeah, I always think a good analogy would be like, you know, I've got a very good relationship with my parents, and I know you do as well, but it's sort of that, like, I know if I'm ever in really, really deep shit, I can pick up the phone and I can call my mum or dad, and no matter how inconvenient it is, or how stupid I've been, or, you know, how much they probably just want to smack me around the head and go, "You're an idiot, you've created a mess," they're going to follow through.
Yeah.
You know, so I guess there's that, the whole, to me, there's this like industry as well around like, there's a bazillion podcasts which are like self-help kind of things. There's so many popular, people on YouTube who are spewing out advice about how to be successful. But for the thing that I take away from a lot of it is you can't achieve authenticity via inauthentic means.
Yeah.
Like, if your heart was only half in this, you wouldn't still be doing this.
No. Because people would see through it. I wouldn't, if I wasn't convinced myself, how am I going to convince others? Let's see that. That is the biggest turnoff, I think. If you're trying to get someone engaged and they sense that, again, it comes back to that why. If they're like, why are you really doing this? And if there's a hint of doubt about that or suspicion, they'll walk away, They won't get behind it. They won't answer the calls. And I tell people, I mean, in any of these industries, burnout's a big issue, right? And if you feel like your heart's not really into it, the worst thing you can do is keep going through the motions. Take the time, think through, and come back. Why am I doing this? Because otherwise you will find yourself stagnated. And as an artist, as a musician,
even as a human being, trying to just get on with everyday life, you know what I mean? The thing, I think, look, that's amazing advice. I think for anybody listening, for me, and that's amazing. The thing that I find really interesting that's been, we've kind of lived these very parallel lives where the idea, I want to say we talk about the idea of success, it's very easy for me, for me, I play in a band who's got a very small following. We've been very, very fortunate to do some stuff overseas. When I left uni when I was 20, I had a few goals, and they were very nebulous. Like, I want to put out an album, I want to go on tour. It would be awesome to, play with some big bands or something. And by that metric, I've like blown all those goals out of the water. Like, if 20-year-old me was looking at 30-year-old me, I'd say that I'm successful. At the same time, it's really easy to look at yourself now and go, I'm definitely not successful, because you're always comparing yourself, right?
Yeah.
Or you have new goals.
And everyone does that.
Yeah.
Everyone does that,
My question is, do you find that same, having worked with like the biggest of the big, is there any different, like, does that insecurity still exist, you find, with people at that sort of top level? Or does genuine accomplishment change anything?
I think it's inevitable. I actually think no matter who you are, what you've achieved, that ability to compare yourself to others. I mean, I'm currently reading a book. I started reading it on the plane by Ben Rhodes. Ben Rhodes was he was 29 when he became one of Obama's speechwriters.
Wow.
And then he was with Obama for the whole time he was in power. And pretty much Obama said, there's no one that came closer to understanding how his mind works than Ben Rhodes. And he's just published a book called The World as It Is. And I start off and I read it and I'm like, oh, this guy was 29 when he went to work for Obama, admittedly before he became president. And it got me thinking. I was on the plane and I was like, geez, what have I done with my life? It's the same age as me now. And, I'm not working for a president. And if I want to have impact, then working for the most powerful guy in the world, well, that's a heck of a way to have impact. But then, you start to have some perspective and you're like, well, hold on a sec. Like, there's probably people saying the same thing about what I do, or, what you do. There's probably other people saying it. Like, you always do that. It's crazy. And actually, the best advice I've got on this is from our CEO and co-founder, Hugh Evans. He really talks about the difference between titles and functions, right? And again,
I already see where this is going. I like it.
Again, I was obsessing about, Ben Rhodes. Oh wow, okay, working for a president. But when I actually look at functionally, okay, are you having an impact? And put inside President of the United States, I meet many people who are in politics who are very disillusioned, and I think, well, actually, interested in the function of having an impact, making people's lives better, making a difference in the world. And then I think, well, actually, I'm in a pretty good place to do that. And it's the distinction between a title and function. I mean, I remember at high school, someone saying, what do you want to do when you grow up? And inevitably it's like, you want to be prime minister.
Yeah. And you want to achieve a title.
Yeah, but exactly. You want to achieve a title, and then what? And so I think it's far more important to focus on the function than the title.
Something that I think on that thread, it's almost like there's a scalability to function. Like, obviously, you're working with global leaders. You're at the top. You're at the highest level of government and people in the pop music industry. And these approaches, though, to me, seem like they could scale down to your local community. If you've got, for example, in a lot of developed countries, like a sort of burning issue is, we have this. It's like these, I guess. Affluent diseases, things like depression or youth suicide or things like that. These seem like scalable approaches where it's like this idea of having impact doesn't have to be necessarily to 100 million people. It could be to your small town. It could be to your local music community. The idea of just how do you put on shows that gets everybody to come out and have a good time. And
I completely agree.
But a title isn't scalable. You got to climb the ladder to become president, and then that's it.
But even let's talk about musicians, for instance. Like, I whether it's on LinkedIn, social media, even last night, this guy WhatsApped me. I mean, WhatsApp's an incredible tool.
I love WhatsApp.
Brings people together around the globe. And this was a guy from the Middle East and connected me, I think it was with a Turkish artist who wants to get involved in Global Citizen, and it's great. And often, I think part of the danger, you think, okay, you're a musician, you want to have impact. You don't actually need to wait until you're a mega celebrity. If that's what you want to do, if that's what you feel passionate about, actually, given what you were just saying about the critical difference you can make at the local level, and all change at the end of the day happens at the local level. I mean, that's where a difference is really made. As an artist, you're in an incredible situation and position to do that. And one of the most meaningful experiences I've done in the last few years is back in 2016, I think it was March, I flew to Edmonton, Alberta. And many people say with Alberta and Western Australia, similar kind of...
A lot of space, not many people.
Yeah, resource-based industry, this kind of thing. And I went to this community radio station and I met this band. And I don't know if any of your listeners have heard of them. They should check them out. They're really great. It's a band called Winter Sleep. And this band were great. And they, were performing that evening in this bar. They probably, they went on tour across Canada. They probably at any one time maybe have between 500 to 1,000 people packed out in these bars.
I mean, for any band that's doing that night to night, that's pretty impressive.
I mean, and they would go on the road, right? So, they ended up, I think, at one stage they were in Halifax. It was cross Canada. They're a Canadian band. But I remember they just said they had heard about our campaign to eradicate polio, and they said, well, we want to be part of that. And we invited the local member of parliament along because, again, all change is local, and all politics at the end of the day is local, right? And this member of parliament came along, and I remember we managed to get a whole of these 1,000 young people with the band chanting "End Polio Now." And this MP was a little bit taken back by it when he got up. The band introduced them, and firstly, to be introduced by this band on stage, that's a big thing. And he was taken back, and he just said, I'm going to take this the next day to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Wow. And I remember when he got off the stage, he said, you know what, I had 3 people last week meet with me and talk to me about polio, and I thought, okay, it's one of many issues. Now I've just had 1,000 young people in my district, talk to me about this, or riding as they call it in Canada, talk to me. I've got to do something about this, and I just thought there's so much power in that. And I just think, the real power of Global Citizen, yes, it's engaging the artists, at the top level, and they can set a powerful example. But if musicians musicians, you know, no matter where they are, if they were to become ambassadors for Global Citizen, you know, and figure out, well, what issues can they incorporate, you know, I think that could have a tremendous impact on the community level, motivating people to take action, giving people a voice. And so, you know, I think, you know, whenever, if any of your listeners are in this situation, you know, they can get hold of me on Twitter at Mick Sheldrick. We can Skype, we can WhatsApp, we can do whatever. But, you know, more than happy to have a chat about how they can use their voice in their local community to make a difference. Because that, for me, I think I talk about pop and policy, but to have hundreds or thousands of artists around the world taking these issues, that's how we're really going to build that movement.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Definitely, I'll put links to yourself on Twitter, and anybody who's interested in following this up, I think is awesome, because I know there are people from all around the world who tune in to watch me sort of noodle away on guitar. And I think musicians, you know, if you look at the classic personality traits, you know, there's often with artists, there's, you know, I think most artists are generally very empathetic.
Yeah.
But the flip side to that is that idea of you can often feel powerless, you know? Especially nowadays with music, where everything is sort of moved to streaming platforms, and, you know, you're not just competing against like the local bands to do a show. Like a band like mine is probably, you know, if someone's going to stream rock music on Spotify, why would they listen to Ragdoll when they can listen to Pearl Jam just as easily? There's that sort of thing now where we're all in the same big kind of soup. But I think that's a very interesting perspective to have on it, that it's this is scalable, not just from, you know, playing to 100,000 people in, you know, New York, to maybe the 50 people that come to your local bar, or
well, when you look at, I mean, ultimately what we're trying to do, and this is inherent in the idea of Global Citizen, is, you know, foster a mindset that says we're all in this together. You know, what happens on one side of the world can affect us here, so we need to work together to challenge these issues. And when you really look at what gets people engaged, it's through stories. I mean, people live their lives through stories. That's what's most engaging. You tell them stories, and that's what gets people in. And musicians, you know, are some of the best storytellers.
Oh, right? Definitely, yeah.
So they're the best messengers for this. You need to be having these conversations, and if it's taking place in bars, you know, and so much better, like, for that to be there.
As I said earlier as well, it's music is one of the last things that people are that people aren't cynical about. Yeah. Nearly everybody you speak to enjoys music in a very direct, pure way. You know, it hasn't been. It's not part of this kind of culture war. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just nearly universally people go, you know what, music's a pretty good thing, and if you enjoy it, we enjoy it too. Whether you know, whether you're living in New York and you're listening to the most underground indie kind of thing, or, you know, you're in the tribal areas of Pakistan and you're seeing, you know, traditional calls to prayer. There's something that cuts across it, and I think that's the way you're incorporating that with this idea of something that's deeply political, but not in the sort of divisive,
not in a divisive
tribal kind. It's basically saying, hey, you know, we're a global tribe. A global tribe, you know, music is the language of the global tribe. This should be the politics of the global tribe to go along with it.
Exactly, and you have that, and you can just. Musicians have a knack of engaging people and framing things in a way. I think you're right, that brings people together, that they're actually very credible, you know, when we compare to other messengers, you know, they're ideal. Like, I still think last year I found myself in Indianapolis, on the margins of Indianapolis, and I went to a Green Day concert. And I met with Green Day. They were performing at last year's festival, and, you know, for me it was interesting, because you go to Indianapolis, and I flew in from New York City. It could not be two different places.
If you were an alien that came down to Earth and you said these are two representatives of the same nation, it would be very difficult to understand.
Exactly, but you know what? I saw Green Day, and they were great, and you know, I met with them before they went on stage. We spent, you know, about 30-45 minutes with them, and they basically agreed that all of their shows in the lead up to September, they would go out to their audience and encourage them to, you know, go to their local member of Congress. Go to their local member of Congress and tell them why supporting the end of extreme poverty, why America's role in that was so important. And it was just extraordinary because I saw them, you know, that they would do this in the Midwest of America, and then they did it in New York. And, you know, the way people responded was the same. Their fans got behind it, and that was the extraordinary thing about it. Like, you know, it really, you know, it wasn't this sense of very different reactions. Like, they listened and they got it and they understood. And so for me, I think back to that experience, and I'm like, you know, people can listen with an open mind, and musicians, they play a critical role in that.
So before we finish up, what are you listening to at the moment? How much music do you actually listen to? Seeing as you work with so many big people in a very direct manner, what's on the Mick Sheldrick playlist? So
I tend to listen actually to a lot of the artists that we have performing at our festival, just because I think, you know, from my point of view, if they're giving up their time, and I spend a lot of time getting to meet the artists, I brief them about these issues, then I need to know where they're coming from, and you know, it's also out of respect for them, understanding what their lyrics, because again, if I'm pitching them on issues to champion, it's got to be done in an authentic way, right? So I tend to fill my iPhone up with, you know, the latest songs that, you know, of the singers, and some of them are legacy singers like Green Day, for instance, and some of them are more recent. If I told you who I was listening to at the moment, it would probably give away the lineup for this year's Global Citizen Festival, which is taking place. We'll be announcing the festival on August 7th. And for those of you in New York this year, it would be taking place on September 29th.
Very nice.
But no, like you would have seen, one show we have announced this year is we were asked, and you know, we humbly accepted the opportunity to throw a Global Citizen Festival as part of the 100th anniversary since the birth of Nelson Mandela, and it's going to take place in Johannesburg at FNB Stadium, where they did the World Cup in December.
There we go.
And we've got some of the world's biggest artists, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Ed Sheeran, Oprah Winfrey's coming out for it as well.
There you go. I mean, there's a whole, talking about audiences, for somebody who has, you know, a devoted fan base, that's another phenomenal thing to be able to tap into.
But I've been listening. We've got a lot of great artists also coming out from across Africa as well. We've got Wizkid, who, if your listeners haven't heard about, they should check out. You know, there's
obviously music was very fundamental in the end of apartheid as well.
Yeah.
You know, the a lot of the culture around that, and for such a historical event, the role that, you know, African music played, and I guess the great tragedy of it almost is that it's that when we're talking about rock music and pop music, we can trace its roots back to Africa.
Yeah,
you know, like, you know, the blues, and you know, it's that tragedy of slavery. So there must be that feeling of almost justice to be able to take it back to South Africa and have African artists on the bill as well as global artists.
And we've been very conscious, and I should say it's very much in partnership with a local foundation. It's not us coming in. The government and members of the Mandela's family, and a good friend of mine, one of Mandela's grandsons, Kwaku, is the executive producer of the festival.
Fantastic.
And actually the major presenting partner is the Motsepe Foundation, which is a local foundation, so it's very much in partnership. But you know, we were very keen that, you know, 50% of the artists come from across the continent, and you know, we've got several from Nigeria and Lagos, and you know, I mean, they're just phenomenal. And so, yeah, it's going to be a great way. And already people have gotten involved. On our first day, we had something like over 100,000 registrations on Global Citizen. And, you know, you got to remember, FME Stadium, there's only 90,000 or so tickets for this thing. So already on the first day, more people registered than the amount of tickets. We had over 1 million actions in the first week. And, you know, tickets aren't even available yet. So people have definitely rallied behind it. So it'll be exciting. But our New York show will be also very good on September 29th. We'll be weaving in the Mandela theme. It's also the 50th anniversary since the assassination of Martin Luther King, 70th anniversary since the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. So you look at these activists, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and we'll be doing something really special around that, but also as a way to hopefully kickstart and call for a new international movement, you know, to ensure that no one's left behind. Address the issues like inequality, end extreme poverty, and essentially ensure that everyone, you know, whether they want to be a musician or whatever, have the opportunity to achieve their dreams. Yeah,
it certainly brings a lot of perspective, hopefully, to anybody who's listening, that you know, whether you're a kid who's just starting out playing music, or whether you're somebody who's, you know, you're tuning in, I don't know, because you like my guitar videos or something, that it's very humbling to remember that what we're able to do, we're not only incredibly privileged, but the fact that, you know, we have access to essentially like luxuries, you know. It's I wouldn't say that music is a luxury, because, you know, you can if you can raise your voice and sing, you can make music.
You can,
but
which I don't have that skill at all.
But you had to sing with Rihanna.
Well, sing or chant, or, you know, do something in a very tone deaf manner. But, you would have thought, like, being to all these events, or even, you know, I've been to a lot of Coldplay shows, for instance. Chris Martin.
I won't hold that against you. That's okay.
He's our Global Citizen Festival curator. And you'd think I'd be able to, you know, at least have some sense of tone when I do karaoke, but still, no, nothing there. But yeah, if you've got that skill.
So, all right, I'll chuck all the links up in the description if you're interested in, you know, getting on board with Global Citizen and, you know, doing some actions, or if you want to reach out to Mick on Twitter, he's very active. You know, he's often see you absolutely just smashing through things on your phone in an almost superhuman way, while doing 4 or 5 other things at once. So, man, thank you for your time. Maybe one last little story. What have you got coming up? I guess outside of the chaos of your life, what's on the horizon for the rest of 2018? For you.
I mean, I think we mentioned this special year.
What do you do when you're not doing this, I guess?
Yeah, I was going to say, because we were hoping to raise $1 billion this year for our campaign.
Just $1 billion.
And that certainly keeps me up at night. Look, you know, I think for me, I read, I listen to podcasts. We were talking earlier about some of the great history podcasts.
Oh, yeah.
Patrick Wyman, Mike Duncan stuff. A little bit of Dan Carlin as well, although...
I don't mind a bit of Dan Carlin for a deep dive.
A deep dive, if you've got to spare 4 or 5 hours for one of his podcasts. Otherwise, stick to Patrick Wyman, Tides of History. But it actually inspired me. You know, we both turned 30 this year, and I think when you turn 30... you start to think, okay...
Existential crisis.
Well, not that.
I
just think, I mean, if anything, you start to think more about, okay, how do you make sure you're living a good, well-rounded, balanced life?
Precisely.
And you mentioned I always had this obsession with history, but I also like pubs as well, and I like beer as well. And in New York, there's a lot of great bars with history, with culture. And so I've kind of combined these interests together. And in the process of launching a podcast devoted to historical pubs,
that's just
telling the history.
That's going to tick a lot of boxes for a lot of people, I think.
It comes out of when I was 26, my first birthday in New York. We did this pub crawl, and I turned it into a history pub crawl, and I would tell the history. And you know, we did 10 bars. We started at this bar, Frank's Tavern, in which is where George Washington resigned his his leadership of the head of the army after the War of Independence in America. And we zigzag our way up all these different bars to there was this one last bar in Hell's Kitchen, the landmark tavern. And we ended up, telling all these stories, and I found that people were actually stopping on the street and joining.
Yeah.
And, there was a lot of pressure to resurrect this. So now I've decided, okay, well, we'll turn it into a podcast. We'll get out there and share it. So I'm sure it will not be as popular as your podcast.
Oh, I'm sure it will be far more popular. Believe me, people love to drink, and people love I love a bit of history.
If I can get a couple of those episodes out before the end of the year, then I would have achieved something that I was hoping to do this year.
Yeah, that's man. I think that's such a great idea. So you heard it here first on the Leon Toddcast. The Michael Sheldrick podcast will be coming up. Well, I certainly look forward to that. Thank you so much for your time, Michael. And if you enjoyed this, please hit the subscribe button. Check out Mick's stuff. It's all linked below, as I've said 4 or 5 times now, I'm sure. And stay excellent, everybody.